for Anxiety and OCD, episode 25. Today on the show, I had the privilege of interviewing Dr. Stephen Grcevich. I believe that's how you say his last name. He also told me I could call him Dr. Steve. Dr. Steve is going to tell us about a ministry that God laid on his heart to start that helps churches know how to reach and effectively minister to people with a wide variety of disabilities, including mental health. So without further ado, let's get into the interview. Tell us a little bit about yourself.
Well, Carrie, thanks so much for having me on your podcast. I wear a lot of different hats. So in my tent making job, I am a child and adolescent psychiatrist. So I'm a physician, went to medical school, actually got accepted into medical school when I was 17 years old. So it's a little bit of a Doogie Howser kind of thing.
Wow.
And went through in an accelerated program. So I have a private practice in suburban Cleveland. I teach at a couple of different medical schools. Child psychiatry fellows, I help teach evidence-based medicine to medical students. Again, maintain a practice, do some training for mental health professionals in some of the surrounding counties. And then the other thing that probably takes up about half of my time is that almost 20 years ago, I was involved with starting Key Ministry, which I think we're going to talk a little bit about today.
Okay. So how did you get to that place of seeing a need for Key Ministries or a desire to start that?
So this is probably about 25 years ago now. I was on the elder board at my church, and we had this is mid-1990s, after the fall of the Iron Curtain, we had a whole cohort of families who went over to Russia and Bulgaria and adopted some kids with some really complex emotional, behavioral, developmental issues, trauma, out of orphanages in Russia and Bulgaria after the fall of the Iron Curtain. And so I'm sitting at an elder board meeting, and the person who at the time was our children's ministry director, ended up on our ministry board later on down the road, came in to do a presentation to talk about some of the struggles that these families were having in terms of staying engaged with church. And as you can imagine, that these were folks who had been very devoted, highly committed. These are people who are volunteering, they're serving in leadership roles, that they're constantly, serving out in the community. And because of some of the challenges that these kids were having, it became difficult, if not impossible, for many of these families to stay involved with church, and to maintain, their previous level of engagement and participation. So I'm sitting there listening to this, and I just started thinking to myself, I wonder how much of a problem this is for the kinds of families that are coming through our practice. So in the kind of child psychiatry practice that we had, in the late 1990s, I would say that the most common diagnoses were probably ADHD, anxiety disorders and OCD, depression, and kids on the high end of the autism spectrum, and then kids with other mood disorders, kind of in that order. And so not like anything that we would go ahead and submit to a journal or as some sort of formal study. Over the next 3 months, I just did a survey of our families as they were coming through the office for routine follow-ups. There was one question: what impact did the challenges that brought you and your child to our practice have on your ability to participate at your church or place of worship? And I was floored by some of the stories that we started to hear. One in particular that was really memorable was that there's a family that I was seeing where they had a couple of little boys with pretty severe ADHD. And they started describing to me sort of what their experience was like going out, trying to find a church for their family on the west side of Cleveland, with these two boys in tow. And the comment that the mom made, interesting enough, they ended up at our church and were giving their testimony at one of the services, talking about the impact that the supports that our children's ministry was able to offer had on their family. And the comment that the mom made is that people in the church oftentimes think they can tell when a disability ends and bad parenting begins. And so that, so we oftentimes find that, when we have kids with, different emotional behavioral issues, and in my practice, I see this a lot, where kids who are anxious, it oftentimes manifests in anger, moodiness, and irritability.
Absolutely.
And so I'm sitting there like, listen to this stuff. It became obvious that there was an issue, and as God would go about orchestrating things, around that time, I had one of the 3 original research grants for Adderall, which became the most commonly used medicine in kids with ADHD. So I got asked to travel around the country, do a lot of lectures to different medical groups, physician groups. And in the introduction, wherever I went, I would say something about like the work that our church was starting to do, with families who were having some of these kinds of struggles. And the church started getting inundated with requests for help. Wow. And so basically key ministry came about. And our current mission statement is that our mission is to help connect churches and families of kids with disabilities for the purpose of making disciples of Jesus Christ. But at the core of that, and sort of our original focus and what we saw as the unmet need, was that our focus was on helping churches welcome and include families of kids with quote unquote hidden disabilities, emotional, behavioral, developmental, neurologic conditions where the disability wouldn't be obvious, say, like in a still photograph of that child. Because like at the time, Johnny and friends, Johnny's just absolutely wonderful lady, did great work in terms of helping folks with physical disabilities be part of it. Sort of around that time, like the early 2000s, we began getting like more and more awareness of some of the challenges, for example, that families face when they had kids on the autism spectrum, as more and more kids got diagnosed. So the next wave of this is that churches became very proficient, or many of them became proficient. There were good models for serving families where they had kids who had quote unquote special needs, basically kids with more severe intellectual or developmental disabilities. But by far and away, like if you take a look at like the child population in the United States, 75% of kids with disabilities have primary mental health disabilities. And there's some fascinating research that came out a couple of years ago. Andrew Whitehead, who was a sociologist who at the time was at Clemson University, went through about 250,000 interviews with parents from 3 waves of the National Children's Health Survey, which is it's done every 2 to 3 years by the federal government. This is like where they get, these statistics that like 1 in 46 kids has autism, stuff like that. And interestingly enough, one of the questions that they ask as part of this is, has your family attended a church or a place of worship at any point in the last year? And what they found was that families who had a kid on the autism spectrum were 84% less likely than other families unimpacted by disabilities to ever set foot in a church. But it was 72% for families where they had a child with a depression, 55% for kids with a disruptive behavior disorder, oppositional defiant disorder, conduct disorder, and 45% when we're talking about kids with anxiety disorders. It was actually 19% for kids with ADHD. And in comparison to that, when they looked at like other disabilities, like for example, like Tourette's disorder, kids with like intellectual disabilities, that didn't have much of an impact in terms of church attendance at all. And so like when you start talking about like sheer numbers, and so, in the population we serve, like, children and teens, probably about 1 in 10 meets criteria for a significant anxiety disorder. The number of kids and families who are impacted by these mental health concerns is far, far larger than the number of families who, struggle with what we have traditionally referred to in the church as special needs. So within like the context of like what we do in our ministry, there's a lot of stuff that we do that we put on an annual basis. We couldn't do it last year because of COVID, but the largest disability ministry conference in the United States. We have a group that we moderate for 2,100 special needs and disability ministry leaders from around the country. So that we do all kinds of like training, consultation, offer all kinds of free support to churches. But my role specifically had been to work on developing a model for churches who are interested in doing mental health inclusion. And so we have like other folks on our team who will consult and work with, again, churches that are looking to serve kids with, again, sort of the traditional intellectual developmental disabilities. My piece has been developing a mental health inclusion model that churches can follow if they want to serve this larger population of families that is probably, and it's interesting, there's a guy, Lamar Hardwick, who's he's an African-American pastor of a mixed race church in Atlanta who was diagnosed with autism in his mid-30s.
Wow.
And he wrote this book called Disability in the Church. And one of the points that Lamar made is that the largest minority group in the United States are individuals and families affected by disability. And that when with all the conversations that are going on in terms of talking about diversity and the need for our churches to become more diverse, one of the places we need to start is by thinking about folks who have this range of conditions where many of them, the presence of their mental health condition or the presence of a family with that condition has made it impossible for them to be part of church.
So can you talk a little bit more about that as far as what specific things were they encountering that were keeping them from being able to go to church? Like lack of feeling welcome, maybe because their child had a disability, or just their child being too anxious to be in a group setting?
Okay, so if we take a look at sort of like the mental health, if we think about sort of mental health collectively as a whole, in the model that we put together, part of what we train churches around is the idea of there being 7 barriers.
Okay.
The first one is stigma, in that, for example, there was a study, this is maybe 6 or 7 years old, from Lifeway Research, where when they interviewed quote unquote unchurched adults, 55% of them endorsed the notion that people with mental illness aren't welcome at church.
Wow, that is so sad.
And interestingly, like a lot of in some of maybe the more theologically conservative denominations that are more focused on outreach and inclusion, like going back to theological development, 60s, 70s, and 80s, tend to be the ones that have less insight and less understanding about the nature of mental illness. That no, this stuff is not necessarily a sin problem. That there are things that people are born with. And as you know in your practice, that there are ways in like the lives of individual people who wrestle with this, that there are ways that God uses this stuff in terms of drawing people into closer relationships, a deeper relationship. So the churches that are most interested oftentimes in doing outreach and inclusion are the ones that in some instances are the places where maybe mental health concerns tend to be more stigmatized. So that's the first one. The second one is anxiety. And I would argue that in and of itself is the most, of all these barriers, that's probably the most common one. And that anxiety disorders out of all the different mental health disorders are the ones that are most likely to keep the most people out of church. But we'll talk about that in a little more detail. The third has to do with executive functioning and self-control. Pretty much every mental health condition that you think of ultimately, or to some degree, will impact people's capacity, again, to self-regulate emotions, to modulate impulse control, to be able to plan, to exercise self-discipline. And like folks with conditions like ADHD would be sort of the prototype of this, but again, there are many other mental health conditions significantly impacted. If you're a family and if you have a kid who has a hard time sitting still or not shouting out in the middle of a worship service, or one of I had a very memorable case. This was a family that came from out of state to see me. This is maybe 15 or 20 years ago, where the father was a Southern Baptist pastor in Appalachia, like West Virginia, Virginia, somewhere like that, where he came up to see me. And actually, his family doc gave him the money to come on up to our practice, where they had adopted a little boy who had pretty severe issues with like ADHD and impulse control aggressiveness. Well, shortly after they adopted this 5-year-old boy, he punched the son of the guy who was the chair of the elder board, and they fired the father.
Oh, no.
For not having appropriate spiritual control over his family when it was obvious that they adopted this kid who had been through very traumatizing situations. But when you think about like in the Bible and you think about scripture, like the book of James, self-control is very closely equated with sort of godliness and spiritual maturity. The ability to demonstrate that, especially for kids, becomes like really important if they're going to be able to fit into a lot of activities at church. The fourth is sensory processing. Folks think about this as being an issue with folks on the autism spectrum, but it turns out that like folks with pretty much every condition in the DSM can experience issues with sensory stimulation. And it's particularly common, in addition to autism, among folks with anxiety disorders and ADHD. And so that for some people, like the bright lights, the very loud music, the very sort of like stimulating worship environments you see in a lot of the contemporary churches, for some folks become absolutely overwhelming to the point that it's aversive. The fifth is social communication. You think about churches by nature are intensely social places. And so like if you're somebody where maybe you feel uncomfortable with self-disclosure with other people, or you have a more difficult time picking up on like, tone of voice, inflection of voice, body language, facial expressions, you're really going to struggle in terms of like the interpersonal stuff that goes along with being active at church. The sixth is social isolation, because as you know, think about like folks with common mental health conditions, people with depression isolate oftentimes as a symptom of that depression. Folks with social anxiety oftentimes are going to avoid situations where they're going to come in contact with and meet a lot of people and make a lot of new friends. Families who have kids with mental health issues, the kids are less likely to be involved with athletic activities, they're less likely to be involved in extracurricular activities. They are less likely to be in situations where they meet other families who will invite them to church. Not to mention the fact that for a lot of the kinds of families that like your practice serves and that we serve, mental health treatment can be fairly expensive. And a lot of times, that there are lots of treatment costs that these families are incurring either for themselves, for their children, and either finding babysitters or childcare is too expensive, or when you have a kid where you just can't let any 14-year-old down the street come over and watch them.
Sure.
It becomes very hard to become part of the social fabric of your neighborhood or the community. And then the seventh one is past experiences of church, because I don't know about you, but about 30 minutes into child psychiatry school, I think I figured out that the apple doesn't fall far from the tree. And that kids who have these struggles oftentimes have parents who have these struggles. And so part of the challenge is if the parent had an issue that kept them from being part of church when they were younger, it's highly unlikely that any of their children, in particular kids who may, again, have a similar mental health condition, are going to be part of church. So those would be sort of the big ones that we ask churches to think about. Again, stigma, anxiety, executive functioning of self-control, sensory processing, social communication, social isolation, and past experiences at church.
One thing I will say about that that's interesting is there's this thing with church, it seems like, with leadership and wanting to reach people where you either get one of two situations with a church. You either walk in the door and it's almost like everybody attacks you, like you have the football, like we're so excited to see you, and oh, it's such a great day. Have a good Sunday. Here's your bulletin. That you either get that response or you kind of sneak in the door and then you sneak out the door and no one talks to you, but then maybe you go home and you go, ugh, no one talked to me at church today. I guess they really don't care about me. So how do churches like find this balance and this fine line between reaching people and letting them know that they're loved and cared for in that environment without overwhelming them?
So one of the first things that we try to help churches to do, because the level of understanding, again, from church to church, depending upon like what kind of education the pastors have had, the people who are serving on staff at that church, can vary so much. One of the places that we'll start is by helping to kind of like educate them about some of the things that they would anticipate being struggles in folks with common mental health issues, and to kind of try to put them in their shoes. Here, I'll give you an example of like a little exercise that we would use as sort of like a little starter. Like if we're going in and if our team were involved in like, if we're doing a big training or if we were training an individual church. Let's imagine that Samantha's family lives down the street from your church. Samantha's a single mom. She has a 9-year-old son and a 7-year-old daughter. The 9-year-old son got invited to Vacation Bible School, loves it, wants to go to church every week, and is like begging mom to take the family to church. The 9-year-old son has ADHD and dyslexia. His 7-year-old sister has separation anxiety disorder, and the mom has social anxiety disorder and agoraphobia. Think about all of the potential places where something could go wrong and where they might encounter a problem the first time that they would go to attend a church. And so one of the ways I talk about this with families in our practice and with church leaders is that, as you know, from like a lot of the research that's been done in terms of neuroimaging to try and understand like what's different in the brain in folks who struggle with anxiety disorders, is that we know that they're basically hardwired to overestimate or to distort the level of risk involved with entering into new or unfamiliar situations. And so think about what that's like if you're visiting a church for the first time. So that for their family, one of the places it's going to start is that I would bet that mom is going to be looking on that church's website before she even thinks about like putting her kids in the car and going, because like the kinds of things she might be worried about would be, am I going to stand out? Will I be dressed differently than everyone else? Will my kids be dressed differently than anyone else? That there are enough sort of strange stories floating around. And it's interesting. My son-in-law and my daughter in medical school down in Alabama. And I heard like stories from my son-in-law when he first moved down there and was like looking for a church. And, he was a newcomer. And so everybody stood up in the church and came around him to lay hands on him to welcome him.
Yes.
So again, if you're a mom with social anxiety, even like the most remote prospect of something like that, or having somebody walking around during prayer time, handing you a microphone and asking you to introduce yourself would be terribly overwhelming. So you get over that, you figure out how you're going to dress, and you get to church. How many social interactions does mom have to navigate the first time she goes before she herself is able like to go into the worship center and sit down? Okay, so you have the greeter in the parking lot. You probably have like the greeter or the person like at the main entrance or the entrance for children. Now, because they're there for the first time, she has to register both of her kids so that there's like the children's ministry volunteers who are at like the check-in in the worship center. And of course, they're going to want to introduce them to like the volunteer people who are teaching their Sunday school class. And maybe like if the church isn't too large, probably the children's pastor or the student pastor is probably going to come over and want to introduce themselves. So, by the way, when the daughter finds out that the expectation is that she will be hanging out with like other girls in the first or second grade Sunday school class and not with mom on the other end of the building in the worship service, the daughter starts to have a meltdown because of her anxiety at the prospect of, again, like being apart from mom. So by this time, like they're already like 5 minutes into the worship service. Mom gets to the worship center, and mom with agoraphobia finds there are only middle seats open in the front 5 rows in the worship center.
Nightmare.
Yeah, exactly. and then is there some time during the service where people are expected, like pre-COVID, to greet each other, and people are shaking hands and hugging on your way out? You have people a lot of places have like a welcome center for like new visitors. If you fill out the card, somebody may go ahead and like give you a phone call afterward. And what if you find out that like people who join the church, one of the things that you're expected to do is you're expected to very shortly thereafter become part of a small group with a group of total strangers in which there's an expectation for folks to disclose fairly personal things. That's why you tend not to see so many anxious people oftentimes at church.
Right.
And so, and so part of like what we're doing, like when we're working with churches, is that in contrast to something like special needs ministry or something that's like a standalone program, this is not a program, this is a mindset. And so that we're trying to get pastors and folks on staff at churches to understand some of the things that are going to get in the way, because like the best inclusion strategies are going to be things that are going to like help everybody.
Sure.
And in particular, one of the reasons why like the ways that we had traditionally done disability ministry didn't work and don't work for like the folks that we're talking about is that the last thing that my patients want to do is to be part of something that's going to single them out as being different. And in fact, my kids and teens, what they want more than anything else, to be treated just like everybody else. So you can't put them in a special needs ministry, or you can't expect the folks who are working with kids with autism or developmental disabilities to have a good handle on what do you do with the kid with profound social anxiety, or the kid on the autism spectrum with 147 IQ who has no social skills and is very awkward in terms of like how they interact with other folks.
Have you had churches that did certain things to help with kind of getting people through that front door? That's probably the scariest part, is kind of the whole process of like entering the worship area for the first time, dropping off your kids, those types of things that you just mentioned. What does that look like in a more like anxiety sensitive way, I guess?
Okay, so coming back to like what we were talking about before, the more people with anxiety can visualize an experience, especially if they're going to an unfamiliar place, the easier it may be for them to be able to like get over that hurdle. So one of the things that we talk about when we're working with churches, and one of the components of what we have them think about doing, is a communication strategy. One component of that is to take a look at your website. And you want as many pictures, video. You want folks who are exploring the website to be able to have a good picture in their mind of like what it is that they're going to be able to experience. And so where this would be especially true is that I have kids in my practice where, for example, they're good at that they're okay at going to church. And by the way, one of the ways that you figure out like who the anxious kids are at church is walk into like the worship center or the sanctuary, like when it's time for the sermon, and see who's still sitting next to their parents. That's probably like a pretty good bet. But like, so I have kids where maybe they can get to church and, and they can sit with mom or dad, but the prospect of going to like Sunday school would be like overwhelming. Or one really memorable kid. So there was a kid I had, saw him in like 3rd grade. He had probably ADHD, separation anxiety, and some dyslexia. Kid ended up doing well with some cognitive behavioral therapy, ended up in a private school that specializes in working with kids with learning differences. Didn't hear anything from the family for 3 years. Kid's in 6th grade. And at the church where the family's going, he's not part of Sunday school, but he is going every Sunday with mom and dad. The biggest event of the year for middle school ministry was this weekend retreat. And the mom and dad were friends with the middle school pastor, who put a great deal of pressure on them to have their child go. Well, the kid was still struggling with, again, lots of separation anxiety. And when the kid came home one day, and considerably larger at this point, when mom informed them that they needed to go to the retreat, the kid became extremely agitated and aggressive. And if mom's brother hadn't have just happened to drop by the house, this boy was so upset that she might have gotten seriously hurt. So if the kid has separation anxiety, if we added the details that the middle school retreat is for a full weekend on an island in the middle of Lake Erie that you can only reach by ferry, that only runs during the daytime. Can you imagine?
There's all these barriers.
Yeah. So for example, like when you think about, like, when you're asking people to do something that's like a little out of the ordinary. So with like a middle school retreat or a high school retreat, or like churches where people go on mission trips, the same thing applies. That like an anxious kid would want to know, what am I going to be doing? Where am I going to be eating? Where am I going to be sleeping? Are there going to, are they cabins? Are they bunks? Are there going to be bugs around?
Mm-hmm.
What's going to be happening all day long? So that to the extent that you can go ahead and help folks to visualize that, whether they're serving at a soup kitchen or going on like a weekend, like a week-long retreat to like Appalachia, or whether it's like 2 days with other kids from like middle school and high school. The more you can envision of what you're going to be experiencing, the more you can prepare folks, the better. So the same thing, like, when you think about this in terms of, say, like kids who might be dealing with some degree of anxiety, making sure that you have maybe other kids around who are greeters, who come from a number of different schools, so that kids are likely to see familiar faces when they come. In the same way, like for example, I think about some of our kids with anxiety who have difficulty transitioning, like when they're going to a new school, giving them the ability to come and check the church out maybe in the middle of the week when there aren't a lot of people around, and either to like meet in person or maybe meet by video their Sunday school teacher, so that they know, okay, here's where your room is at. Here's where you're going to be going. Here's what you'll be doing. The more preparation you can do with someone, for example, who struggles with anxiety, the easier time they're going to have with it.
These are really good ideas, I think, in terms of being able to visualize things. I used to have, before COVID and I went fully online, I used to have all kinds of pictures on my website of the office. And I actually paid a professional photographer to come in and take pictures so that people could kind of see the journey from literally like the parking lot to the waiting area to the hallway to the, where my office was in the suite. And it was really neat because the photographer actually told me that whenever his wife goes to a new restaurant, she looks up the pictures online just to kind of familiarize herself with the area. And I thought that was really interesting. So I think it's a great idea for churches to use things like pictures or videos, which is a pretty simple solution, to snap some different pictures and put it on the website to help people feel more welcome, or like they know what to expect when they're walking in the door.
Yeah, I would add, that there's some very simple things that churches can do in terms of implementing a communication strategy that are very helpful when you're dealing with families that are impacted by anxiety and other mental health conditions. In an earlier Lifeway survey, when they asked family members of adults with serious mental illness what they most wanted from their churches, was for their pastor to talk about mental health related topics from the pulpit. Because
huge.
When the pastor talks about it, it gives everybody else permission to talk about it.
Right.
There was a fairly large, interestingly enough, Southern Baptist church here in Northern Ohio that we worked with, who they ended up developing an inclusion plan where they won the regional award for cultural competence from the National Alliance for Mental Illness. So like some of the things that they did, speaking into this, is that they did a 5-week teaching series on what the Bible has to say about anxiety, to address the issue of people feeling more comfortable about self-disclosing. I was there on a Sunday at their worship services because I was training about 75 of their children and student ministry volunteers about what they could be doing in terms of interacting, including kids in their ministry. So I went to a worship service, and they ran a video about 3 minutes long that day with one of the guys who was in their worship band, who talked about his experience with panic attacks and how that impacted his faith for a period of time and how he worked through it. The guy who was the founding pastor of the church did this wonderful, it was about 5 minutes long. It was a Facebook video that they produced specifically for folks in the congregation of the church to share with their friends and neighbors who might be struggling. And he started off, "Hi, I'm Rick Duncan. I'm the founding pastor of Cuyahoga Valley Church. And I want you to know that those of you who are struggling with mental health concerns are welcome at our church. My father was a pastor. He struggled with depression. We know what this is like." So something as simple as that's so destigmatizing, put in the hands of the people of the church to share it with their friends and neighbors who they know are wrestling with this. I mean, they've done a fabulous job. So that they, in addition, they actually have a licensed therapist who's on staff at the church to be able to see folks who have issues. They have a Celebrate Recovery group. They offer NAMI groups. We are seeing churches in our area. There are a couple of wonderful ministries that we work with. One is called Fresh Hope, and the other one's called Mental Health Grace Alliance, where there are now networks, hundreds of churches that are doing Christian-based mental health support groups for teens, college students, and adults with mental health issues, and support for their families. And so, it's just wonderful to see the way that the resources are exploding. And I think that it helps that there are probably enough folks on staff at churches with personal experience of this firsthand that they get how it can be an issue for other people.
I love that because what you said about some things being said from the pulpit or from the stage, it gives permission for everyone else to talk about it. And if we don't talk about these things in the church, it just makes us feel like, okay, well, we just don't talk about that here. It's kind of like parents when they don't talk to their kids about sex. It's just kind of like, well, that's a taboo subject. I guess that's off the table. And we don't realize a lot of times how impactful that is. And especially because too often we put people in leadership on pedestals and think they don't have any problems, but they have problems too, just like everyone else. They have struggle and sin and things that God's working on in their life. And it's so powerful when we're able to have authentic vulnerability in the church. And I hate that so many times there's too many barriers to us to be able to do that. But it's life-changing when that happens in a positive and healthy way. Too many of these things that you listed and the 7 things really keep us from being able to connect in community with other believers the way that God has designed us to be in community and to stay connected and to grow closer to God and grow closer to each other. So, yeah. Tell us a little bit about your book, The Mental Health and the Church.
Okay, so mental health in the church it's basically sort of the detailed version of our inclusion model that we share with churches.
Okay.
So again, like the first part of it, we talk about that there are 7 specific barriers that oftentimes make it more difficult for families and individuals impacted by mental illness to be part of church. We also give them 7 specific strategies or ways that they can think about how they might think about responding. And so that some of the things that are really essential would be having the church commit that they're going to do an inclusion plan and that there be some education of the leaders of the church. The second has to do with the little acronym is teacher. So the first is setting up an inclusion team. The second is looking at sort of the ministry environments or the nature of the physical spaces in which ministry takes place. So are there ways of making them more sensory friendly? Are there ways, for example, to design, we're involved with a church where we were helping them redo their middle school and high school ministry area so that kids who have attention issues would take away more from the teaching and the experiences that they have there. A stands for focusing on activities that are most essential to spiritual growth. So that if you want folks to be in a small group, it's very important to train the leaders of your small groups in terms of like how you welcome someone who might have issues with anxiety, or someone who might be withdrawn because they're struggling a little at that point in time with an exacerbation of depression. C has to do with with the communication strategy we touched on. H has to do with offering practical helps. That in the Lifeway study, one of the largest disconnects between what pastors believed about their churches and what families said about their churches was that most pastors believed that their church had a current list of mental health facilities and professionals that they could refer people to, but 70% of families said that that wasn't the case. One of the things that like the church that I go to does is that before COVID, we had large respite events where we would have like 85 kids at the church on a Friday night. And probably the majority of them had a primary mental health issue where, again, the parents were able to get an evening out. And then our most popular blog post a couple of years ago was entitled, "We Had No Casseroles." And it was about, there was a 60 Minutes segment that was done where they were talking about the struggles that parents in Virginia were having, like with teens and young adults getting mental health service. And so whoever from 60 Minutes was interviewing the one mom, and she goes, when our 13-year-old daughter broke her leg in a skiing accident and was in the hospital for a week for surgery, every single night, somebody from our church brought us food. 6 months later, when she overdosed and was on a psychiatric ward at the local hospital, we had no casseroles. And so like, why do we as a church think about like treating those things so differently? So like what are some practical things that we can do to help? Then E is education and support. So offering like a Fresh Hope group, offering like a Grace group through Mental Health Grace Alliance, having NAMI doing their education and family support groups, making sure that the folks who are in leadership positions in the church get the training they need to understand. And then R has to do with like releasing your people for ministry. For this to work, folks on staff at churches have like so much on their plate that they're overwhelmed. The people need to take ownership of this because God has positioned all of us in terms of like where we work, where we go to school, in our neighborhoods. We all know people who struggle with this. And I actually think the best inclusion plan is having a trusted friend coming alongside you the first few times that you go to a church who can help to like navigate the overly exuberant door greeters and some of the other challenges and help their friends and help their loved ones to be able to navigate some of the things that might make them a little more uncomfortable.
Yeah, that's good. That's really good. I think all of this information is really helpful, and I'm glad that you started this ministry and God put it on your heart because I'm sure it's grown and there continues to be a need for it as more churches are becoming open to how can we include all people. So as we're winding down towards the end here, at the end of every podcast, I like our guests to share a story of hope, which is a time in which you received hope from God or another person.
Well, I think that the thing that brings me the most hope is seeing the way some of the churches that we serve and other like-minded ministries serve are embracing and understanding this cause. That when we started doing this, that there is literally nothing out there. That we have a group that we moderate for mental health inclusion ministry leaders that now has several hundred members. We're seeing churches implement plans and we're seeing them welcome more people. We're into the hundreds now in terms of churches that are hosting grace groups and hosting Fresh Hope groups. And when we get invited to like different conferences and have the opportunity to train, there are more people signing up for this mental health stuff than for any of the other things on the program at these conferences. And so it's really encouraging that after a very long time, when we see churches get it. I was at a very large church training over 200 volunteers one weekend. And it was a church people would be familiar with that was very interested in doing this. And so I stayed for worship on Sunday. And it was interesting because the lead pastor wasn't there, but he knew what was going on. At the beginning of the worship service, he starts it off by saying, I'd like to start by praying for anyone who's with us today who might be struggling with depression. Didn't have to do a whole sermon on it, but simply by saying something like that,
right,
the folks who were there that day who may have been wrestling with stuff knew that they would be welcome and knew that it was okay to talk about.
That's good. That is very hopeful. Yeah. Well, thank you for coming on and sharing your wisdom. And I'll put all the links in the show notes to Key Ministries and the book and how people can get in contact with you.
Well, yeah, that would be awesome. And, I'd like to get together and say hello. My daughter goes to Belmont University in Nashville, and she's hoping to become a psychologist.
Oh.
We have issues with anxiety and depression and things like that. So I do get a chance to be in your neck of the wood fairly often, Miss Carrie.
You're welcome to sit down with me for lunch anytime. We'll get together.
I'll look forward to it. Thank you.
My hope really for this episode is for people to share this type of information with their pastor or ministry leaders, small group leaders, children's ministry leaders. Your church really may not know that this help and support is available. And also, this episode may be an open door for you to start to talk with the people in your congregation about some of your own mental health struggles. So if it helps to share the episode with them and say, hey, sometimes this is my experience at church, I hope that this episode helps you do that as well. So I promised for our 25th episode that I would be giving something away. And I am giving a $25 Amazon gift card away to one of our email subscribers. So if you're saying, Carrie, how do I get on the email list? It's super easy. You go to www.hopeforanxietyandocd.com. There'll be a box up at the top where you can put in your name and your email address, and then you will automatically get a free relaxation download. It's something that I use with clients that people have found particularly helpful. You have 2 weeks to become a subscriber to qualify for the Amazon gift card, and I will be letting the winner know by email and also posting about it on Facebook and Instagram. As always, thank you so much for listening. Hope for Anxiety and OCD is a production of By the Well Counseling in Smyrna, Tennessee. Our original music is by Brandon Mangrum, and audio editing was completed by Benjamin Bino. Until next time, may you be comforted by God's great love for you.